We're going to see how this goes. All right. My name is John. I'm the lead pastor and super glad that you guys are here today. Assuming that my clicker works today, what we want to talk about is this idea of what is a big deal. That's a phrase people throw out sometimes as they're trying to describe something going on. And they're like, no. Like, you have to understand, like, this is a big deal. So a couple, for instance, a few weeks ago we had the eclipse. For how many people the eclipse was kind of a big deal for you? That was something where it changed your schedule. It changed like the way in which you were going to. A normal Monday, it was a Monday, right? All of a sudden became like a really unique thing because, like, hey, this thing is happening and that's a big deal and that's pretty exciting. This past week, Bruce Springsteen was here in town. Did anybody go see Bruce? Would anyone have liked to go see Bruce? Okay, you just didn't have enough money. Okay, so for some of you, that would have been a pretty big deal. So that's pretty. Would anyone, if you got a free ticket, you still wouldn't have gone? It just no appeal to you? All right, that's honest. All right, that's good. I like that. Tomorrow is Earth Day, and so for some people, that's like a really big deal. Like, yeah, Sue's raised her hand. That's a pretty big thing. So some of our teens, actually, later today, we're going to do an Earth Day cleanup because we think, hey, the Earth's a pretty big deal, and if we can, we should focus on helping it every day, but it's kind of a big deal. Taylor Swift is supposedly a big deal. So any Swifties in the room? Attaboy, Josh. I like it. Do you have like a shirt on underneath the sweater? That would have been pretty awesome. Lots of different things in the world, depending on who you are, what you think, there's different things that are a big deal. And the reason why we're talking about that, we started a series a couple weeks ago where we're going through an ancient letter called Colossians. And the story, kind of the setup to Colossians, was that they're back 2,000 years ago, in the Roman Empire, the Christian movement was kind of exploding right after Jesus was born, and there was all these different churches that were kind of popping up in all these Roman cities. And so there was a guy named Epaphras, and Epaphras grew up, lived in a city called Colossae. And at some point, Epaphras decided he was going to leave Colossae. We're not really sure why. And while he was traveling, he came in contact with a guy named Paul, as in the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul shared with Epaphras the story of Jesus. And then Epaphras decided, you know what, I am going to become a believer in this Jesus guy. I think this Jesus guy sounds like kind of a big deal. And then Epaphras, after traveling around with Paul for a little while, went back to Colossae, and he started to tell his friends, his neighbors, his coworkers about the story of Jesus. And some of them decided, we are going to become believers in Jesus. And then all of a sudden now there was this group, maybe it was 20, 30, probably no more than 50 or so folks in Colossae who all had this common belief in Jesus. And then Epaphras traveled away from Colossae at some point, and he went to go visit his new friend, the Apostle Paul, and the Apostle Paul was in prison. We don't know exactly where he was in prison. He might have been all the way over there in Rome, but what kind of my school of thought, what a lot of scholars, is that he was in the city of Ephesus, so not too far away from Colossae. And the way a prison would have worked back then is Paul would have been in some sort of like a pit or something like that. Prisoners were kind of left to die unless they had good friends who would come and kind of care for them and give them food. And so for a little while, Epaphras was one of the guys who was like going to the pit that Paul was in, and he's giving Paul food, helping him stay alive. And he's telling Paul, you're never going to believe that thing you told me about Jesus. I told some of my friends in Colossae about Jesus, and now there's this group of people, and Paul's like, I want to send a message to those folks who believe in Jesus in the city of Colossae. And so he wrote, or probably more dictated, the Apostle Paul a letter that then he sent with Epaphras back to Colossae. And so if you have a Bible, the Bible is not actually a book, it is a book, but it's a collection of ancient documents. So there's 66 unique different documents that are kind of collected and bound together in this book. And one of them is this ancient letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to this church in Colossae. And we get a chance to read it, which I think is a pretty cool thing. And one of the things that we really want to try to drive home as we go through, we're going to go through and through June at least talking about this letter, is as we read this, that we're talking about like real people in a real place. And so this is in Turkey. If you were to go there right now, you would see this kind of like mound of dirt. The city of Colossae was destroyed by an earthquake in 65 AD-ish, and it was never rebuilt. And to this date so far, it hasn't been excavated. But if you were to go there and if you like had permission, however something like that works, and you were to dig underneath that dirt, you would find the ancient city of Colossae. You would find the statues, you would find the things that used to form the houses and the temples. You would find this place because 2,000 years ago, there was a real Roman city with real Roman Turkish people, and the gospel took root in there. And the question that we want to look at today of this letter is this idea of when Epaphras met Paul and Paul is telling him about Jesus, and then when Epaphras goes back and he tells the people in Colossae about Jesus, what was it exactly that they were told? At the beginning of the letter, it says, you learned it from Epaphras. What was this it that Paul told Epaphras that like so moved Epaphras that he's like, I want to become a believer in Jesus? And what was this it that when Epaphras told his neighbors about it, that they decided that they wanted to become one of these early churches? And what it was this thing called the gospel, which then raises a question of what is the gospel? And that's one of those things that if we were to go around the room and all give different definitions of the gospel, we might come up with different ideas. But what was it exactly that when Paul says, this is the gospel that you heard, what was it that they heard that then changed them so much? And that's what we're going to talk about today. This isn't going to be the only time we're going to talk about the gospel. And so this message today actually is going to be a two-parter. The original idea was that we were going to go through this whole section that's printed in your program today of Colossians. And when I finally kind of put everything together, I figured we had about an hour and a half's worth of content. And so, which you guys would have loved. It was really, really good. But we decided to split it into at least two. So we still might be long today, but it's going to be less than it would have been. But this idea of what the gospel is incredibly, incredibly important. And we actually talked about this a few months ago. Some of you might remember. So back in February, Heather, who's one of our communicators, did the opening today, is going to do communion, did a fantastic job of talking about this idea of the gospel. But as you can guess, this is just an incredibly central idea to what it means to be a church and to follow Jesus. And so it's worth talking about again. But for today, kind of our focus is that the idea of gospel is news that is a big deal. So 2,000 years ago, this word gospel wasn't a religious word. It wasn't a church word. It was just a word. And the word meant this, I want to proclaim something that is a big deal. So when something was a big deal, someone would proclaim that a gospel, something good, something major has happened. And this happened in lots of different occasions. And so, for instance, the setting of the first marathon, I ran my 10th marathon yesterday, so not so humble brag. Yeah. But some of you guys might know this story. The setting of the first marathon was a battle in 490 BC, so almost 500 years before this church in Colossae would have come on the scene. And it was when Greece was invaded by Persia, and despite all odds, Greece managed to win. And after the battle, Greece sent out heralds to take the euangelion, the good news, the gospel, out to every town and village in the country to tell people what had happened and to declare to them that they were free, and those Herods were called evangelists. It was the gospel, this gospel. And what the gospel was in this case was that Greece had won, and so therefore Greek rule and the Greek way of life was going to continue to permeate this area. And so that was good news if you were a Greek, or if you were a big fan of the Greek rule of life or the Greek rule. If you were a Persian, that might not have been very good news to you, but they proclaimed it still as good news. There was other different gospels around. Alexander the Great had a gospel. There was many different people who kind of proclaimed these different ideas of the gospel. But by far, 2,000 years ago, if you could go back, walk the city of Colossae, what most people would have registered in their mind when they heard of gospel was they would have thought of something called the gospel of Caesar. We're talking about the city of Colossae, this church that showed up there. Paul was probably in jail in Ephesus, is what I believe. And it's not shown there, but if you could go just a little bit south of Ephesus, there was another ancient Roman city called Prim. And in Prim, back in 1899, so a little over 100 years ago now, some archaeologists were digging up that city. That was a city that has been excavated. And as they were excavating this ancient city, they found this tablet. James is going to read that tablet for us. So, just kidding. He's the only person here that can read Greek. But on this tablet, it was a calendar entry, and it has what's been known in history. You might have studied this if you took a Roman class in college. What's been called the Gospel of Caesar. And I'm going to read you just a couple excerpts from what was on here. And what I want you to notice as we read through this is that if you've kind of been around church world for a while, some of this might sound familiar. If you've sang some Christmas songs before, some Easter songs before, some of this might sound familiar. Some of the songs that we sang this morning, and especially if you've taken time to read through this letter of the Colossians, then some of this might sound very familiar, but they're not talking about Jesus. They're talking about Caesar. So here's what the Gospel of Caesar says. The birthday of Augustus has been for the whole world the beginning of the gospel, the euangelion, concerning him. So we're going to celebrate every year the birthday of Augustus, because when Augustus was born, it was the beginning of good news for the whole world. Can you think of anyone else's birthday that we celebrate every year with the proclamation that it was good news for everybody? The most divine Caesar. They worship Caesar not just as a guy, but as a god. We should consider equal to the beginning of all things. Caesar is the beginning of everything. For when everything was falling into disorder and tending towards dissolution. So the Roman Empire was kind of falling apart. There was lots of battles. And so Caesar Augustus came in and brought this world that was falling apart. He restored everything and once more gave the whole world a new aura, a beginning. He took a world that was falling apart and he allowed it to be born again. Caesar, the common good fortune of all, the beginning of life and vitality. If you want to find life and vitality, go to Caesar. Augustus, who has been sent to us and our descendants as Savior, has put an end to war and has set all things in order. Everything is the way it should be because of Caesar. And whereas, having become God, Caesar has fulfilled all the hopes of earlier times. All of history has been leading to the culmination of finally Caesar is here. And so, this is the gospel. The gospel is that Caesar is here, and that Caesar is your Savior. He is your hope. He is your peace. He is life and vitality. He is divine. He is the restorer of the whole world. And into this Roman Greek world of the gospel of Caesar, all of a sudden, there was a new group of people that were popping up in all of these different new churches, 30, 40, 50 people in all of these Roman towns, and they were proclaiming a new gospel. And the gospel that they were proclaiming was that all those things that maybe you're saying are to Caesar, we believe those things are actually not true of Caesar. We believe that those are true of Jesus. The gospel that they promoted was that here's what we want you to know is that the it that we are telling you about is that there was a better and real divine being, a better and real Savior, and it is not Caesar, but it is Jesus. So what did they proclaim? What did Epaphras hear? What did Paul hear? What was it that these early Christians in Colossae heard? What I believe they heard when they heard the gospel was that they heard about Jesus. Because here's what the gospel is. The gospel is Jesus. All of Jesus. Everything that Jesus ever said, everything that Jesus ever did, everything that Jesus accomplished while he was on earth, all the sermons, all the miracles, all the lessons, his crucifixion, his resurrection, everything, that was the gospel. And that's what they presented. And here's why I believe that. Again, in your Bible, collection of 66 different books, there is actually 4 different books in here, 66 different books. 4 of those books are what we call the gospel. And so there's 4 different books in here that we call the gospel. This thing's like going crazy today. There you go. I gave the answer away. I was going to do a quiz, and now it's good. You get to see the back page, like one of those deals. So there's 4 different books in the Bible that are called the gospel, and those books are, in case you read it, those 4 books are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so if you look in here, there's 4 different books that tell the story of Jesus. Some of you may or may not know, do these 4 books in the Bible, do these all tell the exact same stories of Jesus? No, they don't. And so, for instance, some of you may or may not know this, Matthew and Luke are the only 2 that tell the Christmas story. Mark and John don't tell the story of Christmas, and Mark and Luke tell different kind of versions of the Christmas story. They kind of put different emphasis on different things. They are talking about different facts that happened during that. John, he tells a story about Jesus turning water into wine, kind of a cool story that people tell about Jesus. But the other ones don't mention that story, but they are all telling these stories that they heard about Jesus. And while they don't all include all the same stories, they do all include some of the same stories, especially they all include talking about the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, because those are a big deal, but they all kind of put kind of their own spin, their own emphasis on it. And so depending on the Bible you have, you might see that they talk about it as not this is the story of Jesus, but they'll say this is the gospel. This is the story of Jesus according to Matthew. So here's how Matthew told the story of Jesus. And then here's the gospel according to Mark. Here's the gospel according to Luke. And here's the gospel according to John. And they're all kind of giving their different emphasis on this, because when they told the gospel, what they were doing was they were telling through their best kind of recollection the story of Jesus. Because when you told the gospel, that's what it was telling the story of Jesus. Theologian and Bible New Testament scholar Scott McKnight says this. He says the gospel, here's what it means to gospel. It's to announce good news about the key events in Jesus' life. So when you're sharing a key event from Jesus' life, you are doing gospel. The gospel for Paul was to tell, announce, declare, and shout aloud the story of Jesus Christ as the saving news of God. And so I don't know exactly what they heard, actually. There's no way for us to know. But I believe that when Paul told Epaphras the story of Jesus, he told some of the stories of Jesus. How many, which ones, we're not sure, but he told the story of Jesus. And same when Epaphras went, he told the stories of Jesus, because that's what it means to share the gospel. To help kind of like clarify this a little bit, I'm going to put just a few of you on the spot, and I'll let you know who I'm going to put on the spot. So I'm going to put Rebecca on the spot. You're trying to like look down too. You're like trying so hard. I'm going to put Marilyn on the spot, and I'm going to put Corey on the spot. And so what I want you guys to share, so you guys know Jesus, you've read stories in the Bible about Jesus, and you don't have to tell us your all-time favorite because that's kind of tough to qualify. But what is one of the stories of Jesus that you particularly love? So when you think about the things that Jesus did, or a sermon that Jesus did, or one of the actions that Jesus did, or maybe the things that Jesus claimed, for you, what's one of your favorite? And we'll go in reverse order. So what's one of yours, Corey? It's true. There you go. Yeah. So time on the Sabbath, Jesus healed somebody that kind of like went against the grain of the religious leaders. And so, yeah, if you tell that story, if that bubbles up when you're talking to a neighbor or a friend, you are telling the gospel because that story is a part of the gospel. All right, Marilyn, what's one of your favorite stories of Jesus? Ooh, mm, yeah, that's good. Yeah. So for folks watching online, watching later on YouTube, yeah, story of the prodigal son, especially the older son, and this idea that, yeah, what that says about me, what that says about Marilyn, of when someone else gets mercy, are we bitter against that or do we rejoice in that? Yeah. Now, Rebecca. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, the woman at the well and how Jesus called the little kids, which would have been such, I mean, talking about sharing the gospel, this idea that this good news is for like all genders and for all ages. Like that was it. When you shared that story, that was the story of the good news. And that's what was going on when they shared that. And so when he learned it, those and other stories were what they had learned. But some of you might say, like, okay, that's nice to like get to share those stories, and all those stories are incredibly powerful. But isn't there like more like oomph to the idea of the gospel? You know, was it just them sharing those stories? Didn't they share a little bit more? And yeah, I think there's absolutely a little bit more because what they were sharing was that this gospel was a big deal. And so one of the things that the Gospels, according to these different people, one of the things that they all point to is that when you look at these individual stories of Jesus, and then especially when you collect them all together and you get to see more stories, they all point to the same incredibly big idea. And so here's how Mark says it. So in the Gospel according to Mark, this is how he begins his Gospel. This is the very first words, first page. So the beginning of the good news about Jesus. And here's what I want you to see about this Jesus guy that I'm going to tell you these stories about, is that he is the Messiah and the Son of God. I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories about Jesus, and if you look at them, what's going to stand out to you is that this guy was not just a good teacher, was not just a good moral leader, was not just a miracle worker, but that this guy was in fact the real Messiah, Son of God. the way that John talks about it. We looked at this a lot in our last series. At the very end of his letter, he says, "But these are written." Here's why I wrote my stories down, "so that you may believe." If you look at this story about the woman at the well, if you look at the story of the prodigal son, here's one of the things that you're going to see. I want you to see that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. That's what it meant to share the gospel, telling these stories so that when you understood these stories, you would understand that Jesus was the real, actual Messiah. He was the Son of God. And this was the message that started to proclaim across the Roman Empire, in this empire where people believed that we have a good news already. We have a story about someone who is born and was divine, and they are bringing peace to the world. But these folks started to believe that there was actually a better king. The way that they presented the gospel, this idea that the gospel of Jesus was a truer gospel than the gospel of Caesar and any other gospels you might ever hear, and it was a better story. And this was the idea that Paul wanted to get across as he wrote this letter to the church in Colossae. He wanted to remind them of this idea. That you've heard about the gospel, you've heard about the story of Jesus, and what I want to remind you of is that Jesus isn't just like one of many other gospels. Jesus isn't one of just like many other religious leaders. Jesus isn't one of just like many other kind of rulers of the world, but Jesus is actually greater, way greater than any others. And so that's why we're using that greater symbol for this whole series, is to try to pinpoint this idea that that's who Paul believes Jesus is, that he is the greatest that has ever been, and therefore we need to follow him and put our faith and belief in him as the total king, as the total Messiah. So the section we're going to look at today now, starting in verse 15 of chapter 1 of Colossians, Paul's trying to like really go out of his way to make this point of just how big of a deal this Jesus guy is. And that's one of the first things that I want us to see in this, actually, is that the Son is, Jesus is, all of these are present tense kind of ideas here. That he's not saying this is who Jesus was when he was on earth, but Paul had this very big belief that Jesus was still alive. He was still king, still ruling, that he had been crucified, but he has been resurrected, and he is now currently all of these things. That the Son is the image of the invisible God. That idea of image of God would have been something that very much registered to this group in Colossae. They would have seen all kinds of images of God. We assume, I say it hasn't been excavated yet, but based off of other cities in the Roman Empire in that area, you could have walked around the city of Colossae, and there would have been numerous temples to Greek gods. So to Zeus, to Apollos, to all these kind of different Greek gods. And in every single one, there would have been a statue of some kind. And the idea was that this image was supposed to show you something about what God was like. And then you could have walked around the city, and there would have been all kinds of engravings of Caesar, the new Caesar, Nero, as well as the past Caesars. And under the inscription of a lot of these would have been this inscription of that Caesar is Lord. If they would have pulled out some of their money, they would have seen a face of Caesar, and on it, it would have said, Caesar is Lord. They had a very clear image of what the image of God was. And now Paul is saying, here is what the actual real image of God is like, which is a pretty good question. If you kind of can come to the idea that's like, okay, I really believe there is a God. Something put all of this into being. Something is kind of running this universe. You might ask, what is this God like? What does this God look like? What does this God behave like? Ask questions like, is this God distant? Or is this God like close? You know, is it kind of like a way out in the distance, or is it right here? Is God angry? Is God petty? Is God aloof? Is God naive? He doesn't know what's going on. Is God like warm and fuzzy, kind of like the old man with the beard? Like, what exactly is God like? I was running a race yesterday, like I said, and just kind of spark up conversation with folks. And so I met someone, lives in the Boston area, really nice guy. And so it kind of came up, like, what do you do and what do you do? And, it's always kind of weird when you tell people you're a pastor. They're like, oh, I still like want to run with this guy. We kind of got into this like discussion as we're running this race about religion. And he said, I grew up as kind of like a general theist. And so I believe that there is a God, but like, I don't really know like what it's like. And so I said, this is like perfect. Like, what I'm actually talking about this tomorrow on my sermon. And so like, what do you think, if there's like just a God, you're not really sure, what do you think that God looks like? And his exact words were, I hope it's good. That's kind of what you hope. It's like, if there's a God, we just kind of hope it's good. And now Paul comes along. He says, I'll tell you exactly what the image of this God looks like. That this God looks like Jesus. If you want to know what God looks like, then what you need to do is you need to look at Jesus, because Jesus was the perfect image of what God was like. Here's how the Apostle John said it in his Gospel according to John at the very beginning. He says, no one has ever seen God. That's kind of this Jewish idea, is that there was an invisible God. Every temple would have had an image, but when you went into a Jewish synagogue, there was no image because this God was invisible. No one has ever seen God. But the one and only Son, who is himself God, is in his closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. What these early Christians believed is that in the person of Jesus, Jesus was God. God was walking around on earth, and if you wanted to know in the most clear way what God was like, then you looked at the person of Jesus. And so, if you wanted to know, what's the character of God like? How does God treat his enemies? Well, what does love look like according to God? What is forgiveness? Who does God favor? What does God desire? What does God require? Then, according to John, you look at Jesus. Jesus is the clearest representation of exactly who God was, is the image of what God was like. That's what he says. The Son is the invisible image of God. And if that wasn't enough, he continues of just how big of a deal this Jesus is and how much Jesus is the image of God. He says, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. And so first, he wants us to have this idea that when you look at the created everything, so when you look at the created physical world, and if there's this idea that there's like this spiritual realm that's all around us as well, that all of that is created by Jesus, which maybe for them and maybe for you would have been kind of this like, oh, like, wait a minute. I thought Jesus was like on earth, like when they were writing to the church in Colossae, Jesus was on earth like 50 years ago. And he like, lived to be like 33. And like the creation of the world, like that happened a long time ago. Like how is Jesus the one who created the world? Or maybe for some of us, we have our Bible, and the Bible is, as you may know, broken up into kind of two big sections we call the Old Testament and the New Testament. And how a lot of folks think about it, it's like, okay, well, we have like the Old Testament, and that's kind of like where we have like God or maybe the Father. And then like finally then in the New Testament, Jesus shows up, and Jesus is only around for 33 years. And then we have this kind of new realm of the Holy Spirit. And there's this very kind of segmentation of, okay, we got God, and we got Jesus, and we got the Holy Spirit. What if you've kind of grown up in church, we call the Trinity. And one of the things that Paul is trying to do is he wants us to see that all of those, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, all of those are God, especially that when we talk about who God is, that is Jesus. And so here's what that means. That in Genesis chapter 1, very beginning of the Bible, and it says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. According to Paul, who said, let there be light? Jesus. God said it. Jesus said it. Later on in Genesis, when it said, and then God said to Abraham, as for you, you must keep my covenant. According to Paul, who made a covenant with Abraham? God and Jesus. That those are the same. Now, perhaps for some of us, it's kind of like is that, can I really conflate the idea that when God was there, is that really Jesus? And I get that, and you are not alone in that. Once, when Jesus was on earth, he was presenting to a group of religious leaders. And as he was talking to the religious leaders, he said, your father Abraham, let's talk, Jesus, this is while he was actually on earth. He said, let's talk about Abraham for a second. And every good historian would know that there's about a 2,000-year gap between Jesus and Abraham. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. I'm like, what? Jesus? Abraham, you guys saw each other? And the religious leaders called Jesus on this. They're like, all right, you're not even 50 years old. You're 30. They said to him, and you have seen Abraham? Really? And this is how Jesus responded to them. He said, very truly I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. He's saying, before Abraham was born, I was actually on the scene. And then to those religious leaders, he kind of takes it up a notch by using this phrase that I'm going to tell you, as I stand here as physical human being, guy in sandals and a robe, here's who I am. I am. And that title, I am, goes back to the story of Moses. Again, 1,500 years before Jesus. And a guy named Moses was talking to God, and Moses said to God, he's getting ready to go and talk to the people of Israel and lead them out. You've heard that story. Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, well, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? I was I'm going to go, I'm going to tell the people, I'm supposed to tell Pharaoh, who also thought he was God, who should I say sent me? What's the name of you? What's the name of God? And here's how God responds. God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are saying to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. This is the name of God, I am. And now as Jesus is standing before these religious leaders, he says, that's who I am. When God was calling Moses to go and lead the Israelites, that was me. We are the same. And that was not a super popular thing to say to the religious leaders because they thought of the idea of God as incredibly high, which they should have. And so at this, they picked up stones to stone him because they're like, how is a mere guy going to claim to be God? But that's exactly what Jesus did. Paul then goes on. Says, and for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. And he's kind of break that down a little bit. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authority, all things have been created through him and for him. So it's not just that God created everything, but now let's think about some of the things that we see created around us. Let's think about the thrones. Who was on the throne in that day? Caesar and other kings. What were the powers of this world? What were the rulers of this world? What were the authorities of this world? And Paul is saying that God not only created these things, but God actually Jesus has authority over all of these things, which would have been an incredibly crazy thing to say because Paul was in prison. He was in a pit put there by the thrones, by the powers, by the authorities. He's saying, I know how the world looks right now. I know this giant military machine and who's building the roads and the economy and who looks like it's in charge, and we're this little bitty subgroup. But we believe that God is actually the one who has the real authority, because that's exactly what Jesus claimed. When Jesus was being crucified, he was standing in front of a Roman governor. This guy had the authority. And Pilate's threatening Jesus. He says, don't you realize I have the power to either free you or crucify you? And Jesus answered, you don't have any power over me. I know it seems like that, but I actually, as I stand before you, I'm the one who actually has all the power because I'm the one who created all of this. Or another time, Jesus being questioned, and they're asking him about taxes. Like, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not to Caesar? And so Jesus says, show me a denarius, like a Roman coin. And so they give him this coin, and on the coin would have been an image of Caesar with that inscription that Caesar is Lord, Caesar is God. He said, who's on this? Caesar, they replied. And he said to them, here's what I want you to do. I want you to give this coin back to Caesar. You can pay taxes with it, but I want you to give to God's what is God's, which is Jesus' way of saying, you can give to Caesar what Caesar's, but you don't need to give God. Caesar is not God. He's just a guy. But me standing in front of you, I'm the one who actually has all the power. I'm the one who actually has all the authority. Paul then goes on. He said, this Jesus, who I'm telling you about, what these stories point to of the gospel, he is before all things. So he started everything, the creator of all things. And in him, all things hold together. So back in that day, 2,000 years ago, there would have been very kind of Greek Roman ideas of what was holding the world together. And it would have had a little bit to do with the gods, but more of their belief is that the gods were kind of doing their own kind of like craziness and almost like messing with humanity more than really actually like holding everything together. And so they might have pointed to this Greek idea of the logos, which is kind of this like, here's like this like the natural rules that are like holding the world together. They might have pointed to Plato's kind of rationale. If you guys have studied Plato's kind of, here's this group of ethics and morality. Here's just kind of the way things are. They might have pointed to like some science or math ideas, some other like philosophy ideas, that these are the things that are holding the world together. And Paul says, all those things, I actually came before all those things. And if you look into each of those things, if you look into the idea of what the logos is, what you're going to see is you're going to see me. If you look into like what Plato was discovering with the rationale, what you're going to see is you're going to see me. If you look into science principles and math principles, if you look into these philosophical things, you're going to see that it's not that they necessarily disagree with me. You're going to see that they actually show what I am like. So with that point, I want to do like a quick little break. So one of the things that we want to do during this series, like I said, is really try to make this like as personable as possible. That this is like real people in real places who really made this decision that they wanted to follow Jesus as their king. And this is good because you all, I believe, are real people in a real place, in a real time. And so as you look at this, there might be some like room for like, I just don't know. Like, wait, so like you really want like, so did God really create everything? Because like I kind of have like a science back. It's like for me to like put all that together and like for me to like really believe that like this God is actually in charge of everything. Like, can I really get behind that? Can I get behind that intellectually? Can I get behind that emotionally? Can I get behind that with everything in my life? One of the things that we want to definitely let you know is that as you go through this, thinking critically about it, asking questions about it is 100% encouraged. It's a part of the process. So with that, we're going to have different guests each week kind of share some of their story. So I've asked Dave, you can go and come up. So Dave's one of our worship leaders here, has been a part of the church for a year and a half now. something like that, to share some kind of bits and pieces of his story, and you'll understand more why as we get into this. So we'll start off, Dave. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
Hello. So, Dave, why don't you give us a little bit of a picture of kind of your growing up and kind of formative years, because you grew up in a Christian family, and so kind of give us what that looked like growing up.
Yeah, so let's see. My father was a pastor, and so I grew up very much in like a 100% Christian environment, right? So I was kind of growing up in the going to church like 7 times a week. I mean, not actually 7 times. Whenever it was open, we were there, and grew up in a very kind of loving, like healthy pastor home, if that makes sense, which isn't always the case, which I'm very grateful for. And so by the time I was kind of a teenager and started to kind of figure out what that might mean for me, I was like pretty much all in. Like I had a very strong youth group, and kind of that was my culture, and my community was going to church and like kind of following what I had been taught growing up, and what I had been taught was that these are the kind of the facts of Christianity, right? This is what it is, right? And thankfully, I was also brought up with like there's some space for science to exist along faith, so I didn't have that piece where I had to fight with that. But there were certain things that was like this is how God interacts with the world, and that's the way kind of I was brought up. So.
Let's talk real quick about science, math stuff, because that's awesome that your parents gave you space for that. But I know maybe for some of us, this is kind of like, here's like our religious stuff, and then here's like science, and we don't know quite how to put those together. And sometimes there can even be this idea that's like, okay, like Christianity is kind of for like naive people and people who need like a crutch to kind of get through life, but like logical, like evolved people, like they don't need religion anymore. And so if you can just give us like a little bit of, you're a great example of someone who can like both have a faith and walk alongside science. And so if you can just give people like a picture of like, I want you to brag on yourself for a second, because you guys just might not know exactly who's like standing before you here. Like there's smart people, and then there's like Dave, okay? And so like the best of your humility, if you can just give us like a little bit of a picture of like just kind of your degree, how smart are you, Dave?
Fine. So I like math, and so when I went to college, I did mathy things, and so I got a degree in electrical engineering, and then just kept on doing it. So I've been doing electrical engineering for 20 years now. I now teach at UAlbany as an electrical engineering person, right? And so I guess the thing that I'll say about that is that early on, like as I went to a Christian school to get my engineering degree, right? And so there was, even as I was learning about the science, right, I was still in an environment where it was like the culture to just believe in God at the same time as believing in science, which was great, right? But I guess maybe just moving on from that a little bit is, and that was good for me, right? As I kind of moved on from there into adulthood, kind of got married, and then went back to graduate school, and kind of moved out into the world, and kind of left that kind of bubble, I guess is what I would call it. Because throughout my whole life, I was living, like my primary community was always other people of faith, right? All the way up until I was 24 or 25. And then all of a sudden, I'm starting to experience more of the world. And at the same time, I'm going to graduate school and trying to apply this kind of experimental philosophy to the world, right? Where the way that I'm interacting with things is, I'm going to test this design, does it work, right? I'm going to think about this science, let me actually apply my kind of experimental philosophy to it, which kind of started to open up some space where it didn't fit exactly with my faith. It wasn't the fact that science doesn't fit with faith, it was that you can't test things in the same way with faith that you can with science, right? There's not like the nice, if I do this, this works repeatedly with science. But kind of left space for like just kind of a little dissatisfaction there. So that kind of grew in me over the years until I kind of got to a point where there was like a real crisis, which may be the case for many people, ended up being like the problem of pain issue, right? Where I think the big thing for me was, normally when I talk, I have like whiteboards and math to hide behind, so this is a little weird. The big thing for me was the Newtown shootings. I think it was at that point I was kind of 30-ish. I had kids of my own, and just thinking about what it means for there to be a God and also have these terrible things in the world. Like, of course, I mean, it's not a new thing. It's been happening for thousands of years, but that's a really challenging thing. And so that kind of just spiraled from there to a point where, like, well, how much of this is really true, right? How many of these things that I've been certain of my whole life are not real? Like, so I've kind of went through a process of letting some of those things go and just kind of figuring out, can I even like continue doing this thing where I say I'm a Christian, where I say I'm following Christ? And it was challenging for me because that had been my whole life, right? Like from the very beginning, it was always that was the thing that kind of sustained me and the community that I found most powerful. And so at some point along the line there, I just kind of had to take a little bit of a break. And then I read this book. It's called Finding God in the Waves by Mike McCarkew or something. And there wasn't anything like miraculous in it. It wasn't like, oh, I read this thing and now I'm back, you know? Like now I feel good about everything again. It was this person who went through a very similar kind of path that I went through, and just ended up being okay with having both of those things, parts of their life, be in the same life, right? There's the part where you believe and hope for some of these things that you've been taught that the Bible is telling us. Then there's also this part that's like pretty skeptical about things, right? I consider I'm actually a pretty skeptical person. Like I'm a little bit of a pessimist. I like testing things out, and having both of those be true at the same time is pretty challenging, I would say. But I think it's kind of the only way that I found to kind of hold on to being calling myself a Christ follower is being like, you know, there's a lot of things that I'm not sure about. And I've come to the place where certainty is kind of like, it's kind of hard to like say, I'm certain about this mysterious God that created us, right? That's something that I'm not certain about very many things right now, but I do have come around to know that that the places that I've seen God most powerfully in my life and in the lives of people around me are in the way that we love each other, in the way, and I think that the life of Jesus is kind of the most powerful demonstration of that love in our world, and that by following that example, it is kind of the best way to live, right? And so I kind of ended up in this weird place where it's like, you know, if someone comes to me and says, well, I'm not sure of what's going to happen when I pray this thing, right? Or what's going to happen after I die, me either, really, right? I mean, I have a lot of hopes and a lot of things that I try to believe, but the thing that I kind of cling to is this idea that God is represented in the love that he shows for us and that we share together, and so that's kind of the thing that I cling to, and the reason that like I'm still here and still pursuing this person called Jesus, who kind of is still interacting with us today. So
that's awesome. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, and I think if you could go back to that church in Colossae, you would find different levels of what do I really believe in this thing? And they all are there together. So here's how we're going to end it for today. Paul says, and he, Jesus, is the head of the body, the church. So at all these different levels, what they all kind of had this agreement on is that we are going to follow this Jesus as our Messiah, as our Lord, which would have been a really big deal. Because what they were saying was that while maybe we're not sure about some things, that this gospel of Jesus that we're hearing, as Dave just did such a great job saying, when we look at our options, when we look at the gospel according to Caesar, when we look at the gospel according to Alexander, when we look at the gospel according to economy, we look at the gospel according to anything else, this gospel of Jesus is truly better. And so they formed these little groups, like we said last week, these little rebellious groups where in the midst of this giant empire, they said, we believe that there is something better. Historian Larry Hurtado said that one of the things that stood out amongst all kind of these early Christian communities was that this pairing of both what they believed about Jesus and then how they lived because of Jesus. He said there was 5 things. That they were multiracial and experienced a unity across ethnic boundaries that was startling. Because they made Jesus their king, they lived different. They were a community of forgiveness and reconciliation. They were famous for their hospitality to the poor and the suffering. It was a community committed to nonviolence, and it was a sexual counterculture, which had a little bit to how they viewed sex, but also how they viewed gender and how genders were actually equal. And it was because of what they believed about the gospel. And so, for us, our agenda as we're going through this ancient letter to Colossians is we want to invite you to a couple different things. First, if you're not a part of kind of the Jesus movement, if you're not a part of this group of people that said, you know what, I want to believe in this gospel of Jesus, these stories about Jesus and what they say about who Jesus was. If you've never made a decision to become a part of that, we want to encourage you to make that commitment. Maybe for some of you, that looks like making the decision to be baptized, which is kind of this symbol. We're going to talk about a lot in a couple of weeks when it talks about it in the letter of Colossians. But it's kind of this symbol of what it looks like to say, I am going to make Jesus my king. For others of us, it's to grow, to say, yeah, I don't actually know all the stories of Jesus, and I want to know more. Because the more I keep learning, it's going to help us clarify more and more and more who this Jesus was. And then to bear fruit, to be people that because of what we believe about Jesus, it's producing things in our life. What we want you to believe is we want you to believe that the gospel of Jesus is true and it's better, and that Jesus is the greatest thing that you could ever follow, because Jesus is God, is what God is like. Jesus is the creator of all things. And if you look into anything that is true in this world, if you keep looking into it, you will find Jesus, because he is before and through all things. Let me pray. Jesus, thank you so much for coming to this earth, for showing us what our God is like. And thank you that this isn't things that like were true, but that these are things that are true. That you right now are the creator of the universe. That you right now are in all things around us. And that right now you are in charge of everything in the world. All of our politics, all the power structures in this world, that you are actually at the helm. And as Dave pointed to, that's so tough sometimes to wrap our minds around, as I'm sure it was for Paul as he sat in a jail cell, as I'm sure it was for these Colossians as they looked around at the brutality and violence of Rome. And to somehow pair together that you are big and in charge of everything, And yet, evil persists. And yet, they would come and they would declare from their jail cells, from their hidden gatherings, away from the persecution that was coming with Nero, they would proclaim that this God, you, are the creator of the world, and that your power and authority is there. We love you. In His name we pray. Amen.